So we have a question to start off this episode, and it comes from my brother-in-law, Colin Taylor, and said this. Question for your podcast. Does God know all of the ants? Yes. So the thing that I want to talk about off that question.
I remember you saying that.
Yeah. The thing I want to talk about this question, God knows everything, right? And it's not an extra, burden for him to know more about ants, right? To know more about, the granules of sand or whatever. He can think about it. He can hold it all in his mind, and it's not an extra strain for him to think about that. But for us, like for humans, for you and I, Jason, this question sparks something in my mind. So the question is, what is a random factoid, random piece of information that is relatively useless to you, but that you have a lot of knowledge in or knowledge on?
Yeah, so it was obvious that this was useless 25 years ago.
Awesome.
But it's Marvel comics between a certain span. I read comic books religiously, as they say, and I could tell you the lineage of every character. Now I can't. But yeah, I mean, functionally that was useless, and it was shameful if you knew it. So that would be the factoid that I possess a lot of. And the other thing would be like pop music within a 4-year span. I knew everything about pop music in a 4-year span, and then now I know nothing. So in conversations, when people say something, and I'll be, I know about this, and they're like, "Can we talk about something like this decade?" And I'm like, "I got nothing."
So mine are almost always generally sports related. I will have like a really, I'm a big Thunder fan and a big OU football fan, and so I was actually listening to a Thunder podcast during, the early portion of the quarantine and the coronavirus breakout. And so there's no basketball happening, and they're trying to come up with like content, right, to keep people listening. And so they're doing quiz shows all the way back to 2008 when the Thunder started. And, every week they would do like, okay, we're covering the 2009 year and 2010 year. And I would be in my car driving somewhere, and they would be like, who was the 7th leading scorer on that Thunder team? And they're like, these like Thunder podcasts are like, man, that's a really tough one and I'm like, you dummies, how do you not know that in 2010 the 7th scorer was Eric Maynor? Or it's just a fun thing.
One thing I would say to the question, I would say, why would I think that God wouldn't know every ant individually?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just goes to the thing, I can't remember a person's phone number. You know what I mean? I can't. If I walk into a room of new people, heck, if I walk into the room with the church I've been with for 17 years, it's likely I'll forget a name. Mm-hmm. And so we make God like us all the time in subconscious ways. And I think if God knows things down to whatever smaller than the molecular level, it's kind of a, not to critique your brother-in-law, but it's kind of, it's such a human question. Mm-hmm. Why wouldn't we assume he'd know everything since he created everything?
That is interesting. I did a quick Google search, and apparently individual ants know like other ants in their colony. Like there's specific like chemicals and compounds on their, I went deep for this question. Hello, my name is Connor.
And I'm Jason.
And you are listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
So this week, we are focusing on an interaction that Jesus had, and it's found in Luke 20, beginning in verse 1. And it says, "One day, as Jesus was teaching the people in the temple courts and proclaiming the good news, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, together with the elders, came up to him. 'Tell us by what authority you are doing these things,' they said. 'Who gave you this authority?' He replied, 'I will also ask you a question. Tell me, John's baptism, was it from heaven or of human origin?' They discussed it among themselves and said, 'If we say from heaven, he will ask, why didn't you believe him? But if we say of human origin, all the people will stone us because they are persuaded that John was a prophet.' So they answered, 'We don't know where it was from.' Jesus said, 'Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things.'" So to me, that is the whole interaction. Again, this is one of those things. If it wasn't Jesus, I'd be like, that is so bizarre, mm-hmm. the way that was handled. But for me, what amazes me about it is the whole dynamic of Jesus not feeling compelled to give a straight answer, to just say, here's the answer. Now, I don't know what the straight answer would be.
Yeah.
I think this is a brilliant answer, but underlying it of him not feeling compelled, like when I know a truth and you ask it, I'm going to give you that truth.
Do you feel like when somebody tries to evade your question or whatever it is, that they're being inherently untruthful?
I think that's right. I wouldn't have said it that way, but I think you're right.
Well, I think about like when I was a kid and I would try to evade questions, and like that was almost worse than like, for a lot of times that'd almost be worse than like lying. Like if there was a direct question asked of me from an authority figure, which just gets to the whole point of the passage, it was outrageous that I would like try. And now not equating what I did at like 5 years old to what Jesus does here, but I do think that like what you said there, it's really fascinating. So much of the time, the things that Jesus does, if it wasn't Jesus doing it, and if we didn't have the big, big crosses around our necks, we would be comfortable enough to admit that's a little bit odd.
Right, yeah. And I think there is this ongoing assumption that when Jesus says, or when John writes, Jesus came with grace and truth, what that means is that Jesus should make sense to us. And if we just had Jesus here, he would clear it all up. Yeah. Our marriages would clear up, our parenting would clear up, our work situation would clear up, everything would clear up, And yet he's right there, and he's not compelled to clear it up.
Yeah.
And that's amazing to me because I feel such great pressure when I hear somebody that I'm discipling, or somebody even in my congregation say something, and I think, oh, that's not right. Mm-hmm. I feel such a compulsion to, I got to get with them.
All right, so this gets to what amazes me, and this gets very personal for me. So much of the time, I think this is a very, very American Christian thing, that when somebody says something that we think goes against what our church has said, or what our religion believes, or this is what my granddaddy said, and this is just what we do, there's this response of, I've got to make them say the words. Mm-hmm. I've got to make them say the exact, like, it doesn't even necessarily matter if they mean it, but I got to hear them say those words. And for me, I don't want to get too into it because, it's in the past and we already processed it, but that was a big thing for me when I got fired, right? How I was taking a lot of what I was hearing on the outside and how I was processing it internally was, a lot of times it felt more like, well, we need to hear you say these exact words. And it's not a one-to-one situation, but it is so amazing to me that for Jesus, and I'm speaking only in Jesus's interaction here, when somebody with ill intentions comes to Jesus with a question, he doesn't feel the need, like you said, he doesn't feel the need to entertain that question because it comes from a place of vileness.
Right. Yeah, I'll tell you, that compulsion runs so deep in me, mm-hmm. that even this discussion, I feel like disclaiming some things. Well, no, I don't want to, you know what I mean? I want to make sure you understand that as a minister, I do my best to answer every question.
You haven't gotten fired yet, so I understand that.
But that does tie into a deep need that I have, maybe all humanity. I must be understood.
Yeah. I
must be understood. You must understand me. And that's what perplexes me about Jesus. It's this, I'm amazed he lacks the compulsion, but in general, how does he function constantly misunderstood and keep his sanity? Mm. I mean, that is beyond me. How he shows up every day doing beautiful things for people, like undeniably life-changing things for people, and even when they're for him, they misunderstand him.
Oh, that's good. So it's like, imagine, your church decides, hey, we're going to go and we're going to serve the homeless, right? We're going to take meals to the homeless, and we're just going to canvass downtown Tulsa, and that's what we're going to do. And so somebody in your group, like a couple people in your group, they wear like, let's put it even in the Christian circles, they wear another church's shirt while they're doing it.
Oh no.
And in the context of the homeless people think, oh, it's this other church doing it. How does that make us feel on the inside? Oh, we're seething, right? I don't know if we're seething with anger or injustice. I just love what you said.
That is, you're getting into skin crawl, because sometimes people, our church, our memorial, does does one thing they do a good job at is we really strive not to be put off by our differences. We really try to say Jesus is our main connecting point, our political views, our where we come from and as university, who we root for as a team, I mean, whatever would separate us, that's secondary, and ideally a deep secondary. But the idea of when I see somebody wearing something that would be perceived as political, I do not care what side of the aisle that it's on. I have actually met with people. Now, to my credit, I withhold the strong judgment and ask them questions. I ask them questions, but still the underlying thing is, will you stop doing that? Stop doing that. You're misrepresenting. This is not about your political view. And I can't even tell you if I'm being reasonable at all, but to your point about what if they're wearing the wrong shirt, this applies in so much of my life. How I parent, this applies to. Like, this is where it's been a real crucible for me being a parent, hearing my kids say stuff that I don't agree with, and not giving into the compulsion to control them. Keeping in mind my kids are 18 and 21, and I'm not talking about my kid's 3, and he's like, I'm running in traffic. That's a different issue. But when they say something about God that I don't agree with, now I think I want to be clear, it is my responsibility to pray to God, ask him how to provide that wisdom. But if Jesus, I mean, think about how potent this interaction could have been.
Yeah.
If he would have said, religious leaders, let's really talk about this issue of authority. You know?
Well, I think you get into deeper of like, okay, he's speaking and he'll, just a few verses later, he'll give a parable directly against these religious leaders. The reason that these religious leaders are so upset, one, they believe it's heresy. Two, he's upsetting basically the deal that they've struck with the Roman governors, right, to maintain peace and to maintain their positions of authority. The religious leaders are complicit with a government that has crucified their people. They are complicit with a government that are taxing the life out of their people. And it is so, all these things, there's so many sides to them. But I do think it's really fascinating. And Jesus, even later in this chapter, we'll get into, should you pay the tax and, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. I think it's so, like, it seems not just reckless, it seems like, Jesus, are you seeing the whole picture here? Like, how do you not do it? And I think for where you and I find ourselves in late August of 2020, for whenever people listen to this, there's a big, in our culture, in American Christianity, of like, well, you have to stand up and say you're voting for this person for president. You have to stand up and say you're voting for that person for president. And if you don't, then are you really saved? Or if you don't, are you really serious about this?
Right.
And I think a lot of people would have that reaction to Jesus. Well, if you really cared about your brothers and sisters being crucified, if you really cared about your brothers and sisters who were being abused and having their farms taken away from them, well, then you would really stand up and say something. But yet Jesus doesn't.
It is. And I mean, I think for those that have been raised around the Bible and reading the Bible, it can become such white noise. We really don't. We're looking for approval of what we believed in the past. Oh yeah, that's right. That's why I believe that. Okay, good. I feel safe. Instead of really letting the word be living and active and continue to speak to us, because I'm sure from the Pharisees' perspective, they're like, well, what choice do we have?
Yeah.
We just gotta we gotta make the best of this bad situation. And here's the interesting thing. I think they could have got there led by God. But then they depended on that more than God. Mm-hmm. And that to me is this interaction with government. And I have views on how things should go. But to me,
I do too, and they all happen to be right. I'm just kidding.
That's why I never say mine. But it's like, to me, arguing about that falls into where Paul says, stop having quarrels. You know what I mean? That just don't matter. Mm-hmm. But the bigger issue is when I'm in political discussion, I feel like we're asked to, hey, our Christian identity, our unity, our fact that God is for us and nothing can be against us, that's secondary to this political thing.
Mm-hmm. And what I love about what Jesus does is, right, his actions. You talk about this urge for Jesus, speak up and say something about the oppressive government that's over your people.
Right.
He doesn't necessarily say it out loud, but his actions over and over and over again challenge the existing order of things. For him, dining with sinners, that's a political act to raise these people up and honor him that way. The people that, for the Jewish people, if this is getting into a whole nother tangent, but a lot of the religious leaders of the day thought that the reason that Israel was under Roman occupation was that because they hadn't followed the law well enough. And for them, this is why there was so much hatred towards the prostitute, towards the sinners, is because they were part of the active reason why they were being oppressed by the Roman government. And so Jesus, he is constantly living against the Roman way of doing things and the way that the religious leaders wanted him to do it. And when Jesus does use words to speak truth to power, it's never the words that other people expected the Messiah to say. And they're not the words that maybe even we would want him to say. And Jesus just refuses over and over and over again to be put into a box.
Yeah, so I have a natural resistance when you say when Jesus sits down with the sinner, that's political, okay? When you say it and I think about it, I get your point.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think I'm in disagreement with the point. It's the framing. Jesus, and this is troubling to us. We've been taught in order to make change in your culture, you change the system. And how you do that is you take on more power. And that's the fundamental difference with how I hear when we say that's political, and this is not what do you say? This is not denotation, the actual definition of the word. It's the connotation I carry. It's like Jesus took power by sitting with the sinner. Mm-hmm. And I would say, no, that happened organically with Jesus saying, how do I love well? And now I'm in front of a tax collector, and now I'm in front of a prostitute, and now I'm in front. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
The end result is right, but how do we affect change? And I think the American way says, maybe the human way says, we take power. So we run for government, and I'm not. If God tells you to run for government, run for government. My point though is the conceptualization that I have more power if I'm in government than I do as a righteous man that nobody knows praying.
Or that's the way that I have to.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think this is my primary issue, and I really appreciate you bringing this up because I don't know if I've crystallized this in my brain to this point, but it's the idea that Jesus affected the system one loved person at a time, where he could have easily said, let's have public debate. Mm-hmm. I'm running for the lead rabbi role, and I can do 10 times more miracles than your lead rabbi.
In fact, you said there, the reason that the religious leaders don't come back at him in a particular way is because they're afraid the crowd is going to side against them.
Exactly. And that shows where their power was. Now, I do think when there's a beauty. I want to be really clear on this. When I look at that interaction, I'm like, oh,
yeah,
Jesus. Craig Hicks, you say, cool as a cucumber. It's that idea of he's just like, hey, what about this? I'd love to see his face. Mm. Is he got a slight smirk? Is he like, all right, I'll tell you this if you tell me that? And watching them, I think that huddle, that picture in my mind of them huddling, hey, well, what about this? No, if we say this or this, what about this? No, we say this. Yeah. We don't know. Is there a crowd that's hearing them say, we don't know? Because Pharisees, teachers of the law, never said we don't know.
I think for this episode, I'm going to give it special artwork, and it's that, I'm sure you've seen it, it's that GIF of the like young teenage guys, and it's like some sort of roast or something like that, and you have like people like just losing their minds or grabbing their faces. They don't like the comeback from this kid was unbelievable. And like I totally see it, because the fact that Jesus has this perspective, his life is on the point of a knife, right? Like if he says it the wrong way, his life could be over and it could be done with. And yet like he performs under pressure like that. Like that's just incredible. And that gets to another question that I will love to talk to Jesus about, when I see him face to face. Not the first thing, but maybe 14th or 15th was that, like, did he have those things pre-planned? Was he like, was he thinking about it the night before? And like, because like I do that all the time, right? I'm thinking about this podcast the night before I'm taking a shower. It's like, oh, if Jason says this, I've got this perfect. Although I've never said anything this cool under pressure, but I don't know.
Yeah. So I have no memory. Have we talked about what perplexes you?
We haven't.
Oh, let's do that.
So what perplexes me? Okay. So is kind of gonna be a long road to get where I'm going. The religious leaders, they properly diagnose the situation, right? They recognize, hey, if we respond this way or that way, here are the logical outcomes of what is going to happen. And they're afraid that they can't give in to what Jesus says. They can't say his message is from God, because then why would they be upset with him? They believe it's not from God, but they're afraid of the repercussions from the crowd if they say that out loud. What I'm trying to get at is, where is their fear, right? Their fear with Jesus, even though they've seen all these things, right? The underlying fear under all their actions is, what if Jesus is right? Is that a possible fear for them? Because for them, they're fearing the repercussions of if we say he's not. They fear the repercussions of if he causes a revolution, we'll be overthrown and the Romans will, destroy the temple. All of these possible horrific outcomes. What I'm just wondering here is, what's the true underlying fear for them? Because equating it to modern day and our walk with people and our need to control things, like we talked about a little bit earlier. So often in our Christian culture, there's fear, right, of different systems or different religions, of different ways of doing things, of what happens if the Marxists gain more power in our country? What happens if Islam grows in our country? What happens if, the other, denomination that we don't agree with grows power in our country? What's just so perplexing to me is, where's the basis of that fear? Is the basis for the fear that Islam would grow is because what if they're right, or is it because of the physical repercussions for us? Does that make sense? Kind of what I'm.
Absolutely. I think, man, that may be too deep of a dive for me to respond to. I need to think about that. I think it's fascinating on the most surface level. I think it's fascinating that this manifests as clearly as possible their identity. Their identity is not in an all-powerful God who has everything taken control of. There's no peace with them. And I think that shows, and that speaks to me. If I don't have peace, and you say, why aren't you at peace? And I'm like, why would I have peace? The racial inequality and the protest and COVID and blah, 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 blah. Why would I have peace? And you're like, well, are you a Christ follower?
Yeah.
I mean, because this is why you should have peace, because God says again and again and again, I've got this.
And it's okay to be like, oh, I'm afraid of if a relative of mine gets COVID and they're at risk, then they could be, seriously injured or possibly even die. You and I, Jason, personally talk a lot about what's underlying the reason why we do things. And so is the fear of X, Y, or Z, is it because it's going to cause harm to my neighbor? Or is it because it's going to put me in a position that I don't want to be put in?
Right. So let me clean up what I said a little bit.
I thought you were going to say, let me clean up what you said, which I would have just loved. Because I'm sure it could be used, it could be cleaned up a little.
Yeah. So I want to be clear. So if my identity is in Christ, I still feel the fear.
Yes.
I want to be clear. So it's for the person that says, I cannot have peace because these things exist. Instead of saying, my identity is in Christ, I have anxiety, I have fear, I have anger, I have, these emotions, and yet I keep coming back to God's got this.
Mm-hmm.
And then the devil's attacks comes, and I raise my shield of faith, and I'm like, I see that. I see my fear, but I have peace, the peace that defies understanding, that's beyond what my logical understanding would do. It's the access to the peace. So I'm not suggesting I live at peace at all times because my identity is Christ. I'm saying because my primary identity is in Christ, I always have access to this peace, versus saying, how can I possibly have peace?
Yeah.
Okay. That dynamic of our own motivations is so important, and I would say we get locked up into what's my personality type and what's my response pattern, what was my upbringing, in a way to frame who am I.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't, and a lot of times, well, that's just the way I am. Instead of digging into what's my motivation to doing this, and when you look at your motivations, you're like, oh, wait a minute, this is unhealthy. Like, even if it looks like I'm doing something nice to you, when I realize my motivation is I'm trying to control you through my niceness,
Yeah.
That's an unhealthy pattern. It's not loving.
And so we get back to why did Jesus give it a response in this way? It's because it was an unloving question. It was coming from not a true place. You wonder if there had been a genuine Pharisee or Sadducee that had gone to Jesus, whether in public or private, and been like, "Do you realize like what's going to happen? Like the message you're preaching, it could lead to a lot of people's deaths. Do you understand like what this could look like, what this could be?
Right.
Like help me not even like help me understand, but like just a genuine, like even being genuine with the fear and not hiding it under this religiosity."
That is fascinating. So we're back to that response. What if they'd come to him in honesty and vulnerability?
Mm-hmm.
Jesus, we are really afraid that your message is going to get a lot of people killed. And we have families to support. And we know it's this terrible deal with the devil, as it were, but it's keeping us safe. And largely it's keeping our people safe. How are we supposed to think about this? What would that conversation have been like?
Yeah.
You know? And this says, if you have leadership in anybody's life, in as your identity as a Christ follower, how does that apply to me today? To be able to say to God, I don't know how to lead well during COVID. I don't.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm doing the best I can, God, but I'm safe with you to say this, you know? And I think that's true. To your point, what would be the loving way to interpret what Jesus does here? How could you say, okay, if Jesus is love incarnate, God incarnate, then how is this loving to these men?
I'll go back to an analogy. I remember when I was in middle school, I have two older brothers. They were straight A students all throughout high school. They got like the best student awards, right? And so when I got to middle school, I was lazy and I didn't turn in my homework, and I suddenly had an F. And for like my parents who had straight A students before me, and they had straight A students after me, I was the black sheep in this way. This was like the biggest deal ever, right? This was like a massive deal, and we would have these long meetings with my parents and my teachers where they're trying to diagnose the problem and trying to do this and trying to do that. And I remember one day when I hadn't turned in my homework and I had like a 59 in my English class, and my parents called me into their bedroom and they're like, "What is going on here, Connor? Why are you doing this?" And I think I this is terrible. This is how conniving I was at that age. I was like, "Well, I'm just really sad because my grandmother died. You know, because we called it grandma. Grandma died.
Right.
And you know, this was probably like 8 or 9 months before this had happened. And my dad, at first, and there's plenty of unloving things that happened around my grades and stuff like that. But I'll give my parents both credit with this. They're like, my dad was like, "That's BS, Connor. That is total BS." Because for me, I had started to believe that lie, right? I'm like, why is this happening? Why am I not turning in my homework? Why am I not doing this? It's because of this traumatic situation, or it's because of this sad thing that had happened to me, or it's because of this. When the reality was, I was just being lazy and I didn't want to do it. But I had convinced myself, I was beginning to believe these own lies that I'd put into my own heart. And so I wonder, and we can come back and clean this up, I wonder for Jesus, if Jesus had even entertained this question, does that give these religious leaders plausible deniability to be like, well, Jesus entertained the question. Jesus was, he engaged us, but Jesus, doing it this way leaves no room to doubt that he believes they're not acting in a good faith manner. So clean that up however you need to.
No, I think that's a great analogy, and it's the art, if that's the right way to say it, that Jesus had to hear the question and then hear what they're really asking. And so if he answers them, my guess is because of the frame of mind we assume these men had, then what's going to happen is they're just going to attack that answer.
Mm-hmm.
But he leaves them to wrestle with God.
That's good.
Number one, they have the dissatisfaction of the non-answer. But bigger is they've got to own the fact they said, we don't know, in front of people. And one of the first, start of the Sermon on the Mount, I always go to this. The first blessed are the poor in spirit, those people that realize they have nothing to offer God. But see, as long as we think we have anything to offer God, like, God, I go to the right church, I worship the right way, I'm saved the right way, I'm whatever, I'm a good person, I'm not as bad as that person, then we're always going to be at a deficit because we think God owes us. and there's no way in reality that God owes us. And so that dynamic is just really important. So what I think you're absolutely right. In the same way your dad saw beneath, he said, "Hey, here's the real truth: is you're coming with your authority to demand my authority, and you've built your authority on something shaky."
That's good. That's good.
As we talked about this, it's occurred to us that there is so much good in this chapter. We're going to stay in this chapter for a couple weeks. And so I'd encourage you, read ahead. Take Luke 20 and just process that. And remember, just through that lens of, God, show me something amazing. And then being honest with, but this perplexes me. And we encourage you to read ahead and just continue to develop this discipline of reading through these lenses.
Thank you for listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast. If you have a question, a thought, a comment that you want to hear our perspective on, or you want clarification, or just want to engage with us, we would love to hear from you. You can do that through a variety of different ways. You can email us at amazedandperplexed@gmail.com. You can ask us a question on our website at amazedandperplexed.com, or you can go to our Facebook page, or if you know us personally, you can shoot us a text or a message. Whatever way is easiest for you. We don't want this to just be us shouting and laughing and monologuing into a void. Once again, thank you for listening. Grace, peace, and love.